Our final speaker is Lejo Flores.
Okay, thanks to everybody for sticking around, and thanks to James for the invitation to give this talk. The first time I actually attended the systems meeting was last summer, and I really enjoy it, and I think that the reason I enjoy it is because I get to try new things here, so like last year it was Land Lab. This year I was learning a little bit more about BMI, and so it's nice to come to a conference where you're not just sort of sitting through a bunch of talks and actually get to do stuff and go home and be like, wow, there's a bunch more stuff that I need to do. So I really enjoyed this meeting, and it's one that I hope I have the occasion to attend a lot in the future. So my name is Lejo Flores. I'm from Boise State University. There's a whole bunch of additional contributing authors to this slide, but I didn't want to make it too busy. So I guess I'm here sort of in a role of an emissary of the Critical Zone Observatory program and somebody who's doing modeling in a particular critical zone observatory, but as I'll get into in this talk, attempting to use the critical zone observatories as a network of sites to do science about the critical zone. And so if you get nothing else from this talk, here are sort of the 4 takeaway points for you, and then you can go back to running Land Lab. The critical zone observatories are, in the United States at least, supported by the National Science Foundation, and the philosophy sort of underlying them is that they are to be a network of sites that are dedicated to advancing fundamental understanding of critical zone processes. And as part of this, models are recognized to be tools that are critical to gaining insight about these critical zone processes. The current state of the network is such that these efforts, and I'll get into a little bit as to why this is, but there are a lot of robust efforts going on related to modeling critical zone processes in the individual CZOs themselves. These efforts sort of tend to be fragmented for a number of reasons, and so I think that there's actually a lot of opportunities for the systems community and for the critical zone community more broadly to get together and actually promote critical zone network modeling, and I hope that CSDMS can sort of play a facilitative role in that. And having said that, there's plenty of opportunities. There's always good ideas and always opportunities. The money isn't quite there yet, but I think that if we sort of get together with a more unified voice, that NSF will be receptive to to request for additional money. At least that's the hope and that's the thought of the PIs that are part of the CZO. So what is the critical zone? There's a lot of folks in here that are maybe working on sort of coastal and estuarine processes. There are a lot of sort of taglines that get applied to what the critical zone actually is. You hear often that it's the zone from the bedrock to the top of the canopy or the earth's skin, or where rock meets life. I am a big Mad Men fan, and so I would alter this second one here and say that maybe where rock becomes life is a little bit better. That's how I would pitch it. But the idea is that we're addressing kind of this zone where, below here the thought is at least that it's primarily kind of abiotic processes that are going on. Up here we have sort of the climate interacting with the lithosphere, and there's this critical zone in which there's an interaction between kind of the climate and the atmosphere with the lithosphere, and it produces all of the sort of, what we might think of as the ecosystem services that we all sort of rely on to for all of life, basically. So it really is in many ways the critical zone. It's the zone that these earth materials sort of intermingle with climate to become the ecosystem services that we all sort of require for life. So the Critical Zone Observatory is a network of sites. There are at present 10 sites throughout the United States and its outlying territories in Puerto Rico. These were established in 2 different competitions. The most recent one was awarded in 2013. The most recent critical zone observatories are the Eel River, Reynolds Creek, which is the CZO I'm affiliated with, the intensively managed landscapes in Calhoun, Boulder Creek, Southern Sierra, Catalina Jemez, Luquillo, Shale Hills, and Christina are sort of our older brother and sister sites. And so the idea here, in addition to these 10 individual sites, there's now a network office that's being led by Lou Derry and Tim White, as well as a data team that's being led primarily by Anthony Alftenkamp at the Stroud Center. So NSF is investing in this idea that this is a network of sites and that the science sort of being done in these CZOs should be sufficiently general that it's producing fundamental advances in understanding of critical zone processes writ large and not sort of narrowly focused on the individual CZOs themselves. There are also a number of partner CZOs in Europe, Australia, and China. There's efforts to start CZO-like entities in places like Africa, South America. And so this is something that we anticipate will continue to sort of grow potentially in scope and in scale. And it will be eventually sort of this international platform to understand these critical zone processes. A little bit of context about the CZO network itself. So these sites were all awarded in sort of through individual competitive proposals. And at the same time, though, NSF is very serious about making sure that we're doing kind of network science, that we're leveraging these sites as a network of sites to do critical zone science. And so that leads to some feeling within the community that, there's a potential for scope creep in that we submitted these individual proposals that have individual kind of deliverables, but at the same time we're now being asked to kind of integrate with one another, and at the same time not being, the resources for that aren't immediately available. So it involves some kind of need to reconcile those different deliverables and different science questions, while at the same time looking for new opportunities to engage with the broader community and maybe begin posing questions or looking at these individual sites and asking the question, posing the science questions that are maybe more generally applicable or require multiple CZOs to be addressed. So it's both challenge and opportunity in terms of the way that the CZO network was set up. So I was actually this is a conceptual model of what an Earth system model is, and Forrest did a nice job of talking about what Earth systems models are in the context of what the global climate modeling community thinks of an Earth systems model. And this is a conceptual model from 1985, and I really love this conceptual model, and I don't know, and I would love to talk to somebody, but what's really interesting about this is that soil development is smack in the middle of this, and I don't believe that Bretherton was necessarily a geomorphologist. So it was really interesting to me why that's in the middle, because the way that I sort of tend to think of soil development here is as almost sort of the dynamics of the critical zone, right? So there's a recognition in where Earth systems models were going that the critical zone is sort of important, and it was sort of placed at the center of this conceptual model. So I don't know if that was necessarily, maybe in drawing these kind of flowchart-like diagrams, you always wind up with boxes that need to, there's spaces where a box can fit. So maybe that was the reason. But I like to think that it was maybe a little bit more forward-looking than that. So I think that there's a very important link between the kinds of work that's being done amongst the critical zone observatories and sort of these larger efforts to model the Earth system at longer and larger spatial, temporal and spatial scales. So I'm going to come back to this idea because I think that there's actually places where the critical zone community is in a very good position to inform the Earth system modeling community with some of the expertise and some of the science questions that have emerged out of multiple critical zone observatories in ways that potentially have important ramifications for the Earth systems modeling community. But before getting to that, I want to go through sort of some specific examples from Reynolds and just sort of showcase As an example, some of the activities that we're doing in Reynolds Creek Experimental Watershed and Critical Zone Observatory, and start to demonstrate hopefully how those have ties in with the larger systems community, as well as maybe with the Earth systems modeling community. So just a little bit of background and context to the Reynolds Creek CZO. It has existed as a USDA Ag Research Service experimental watershed since the 1960s. Primarily, it was kind of focused on, it was the kind of preeminent rangeland watershed in the ARS suite of experimental watersheds. So its focus was really kind of more on the, water supply in sort of rangeland ecosystems kind of focus. So there's a little bit of kind of intensive ag in Reynolds Creek, but it's primarily kind of sage steppe ecosystem with some forested sort of subcatchments. But because it's been around for such a long time, there is this very rich history of data, both of a sort of climatological nature. So there's meteorologic data at hourly timescales going back to the 1970s at multiple sites within Reynolds Creek. There's also a number of sort of process and individual studies that have been conducted in Reynolds Creek over the years. And so there is this sort of very rich history of data and work that's been done historically and continues contemporarily in Reynolds Creek that make it a really excellent place to test a lot of these hypotheses with respect to critical zone processes. Some of the issues or kind of boundary conditions of the Reynolds Creek experimental watershed that we deal with are large gradients in elevation, slope, aspect, and vegetation cover. These are, it might not look like it to the untrained eye, but these actually are managed landscapes. There is a mixture of public and private land ownership in Reynolds Creek. There's grazing, there's prescribed fire, and there's some fuels treatment in some parts of the watershed. And we have other issues that are kind of human-y in nature that I'll get to in a few slides that that deal with sort of the invasion of cheatgrass that is an ongoing challenge in the Great Basin ecosystem. And in addition to that, there's been a lot of work that's been published by folks like Danny Marks and Mark Seifrid, who are affiliated with ARS, on the sort of observed climate change that is taking place and has been observed historically in Reynolds Creek. So if you look at, for instance, nighttime low temperatures over the past 30 years, there is a very clear, significant, statistically robust increase in nighttime low temperatures. And I believe over the past 3 decades, it's something on the order of like 5 degrees centigrade. So it's not insignificant. So the charge of the Reynolds Creek experiment, or the Reynolds Creek Critical Zone Observatory, is to gain insight into how the distribution of soil carbon is going to change under future scenarios of climate change, land management, and other sort of potential disturbances. So things like, the invasion of cheatgrass and other kind of potential stresses and pulses. So that's kind of our charge, that's our unifying sort of mantra in the Reynolds Creek CZO. A little bit more geographic context. So this is Idaho. This is Boise. Reynolds Creek is about maybe 60 kilometers to the southwest of Boise. Reynolds exists within this sort of larger, what we might call an extended experimental framework or extended test bed of sites. I'll present a little bit of work today from a much smaller experimental watershed that's just northeast of Boise called Dry Creek Experimental Watershed that was established by my colleague at Boise State, Jim McNamara. There's also a number of sort of ecological process studies that occur in this. This is the Morley-Nelson Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area. So this is an NCA that's dedicated to, it's a throughway for birds of prey in the region, but it's also sort of emblematic of the invasion of cheatgrass in the Great Basin. And so there's a lot of process studies looking at invasives and how they influence water, energy, and biogeochemical cycling that are ongoing in the birds of prey. At the same time, we are sort of at the at the southern fringes of kind of the Sawtooth and Boise National Forests, so we're kind of at this strong ecotonal gradient. And at the same time, this Mary Poppins-like figure here is what we call the Treasure Valley. This is the city of Boise, and this is the agricultural areas that the city of Boise is tending to displace these days with continued urbanization. So Reynolds Creek is actually situated is embedded within this larger region in which there are some really compelling changes that are going on. So it's actually kind of a really cool place to be conducting this kind of research. This, I think, is in some sense the prize-winning figure that won us the proposal. This is sort of our conceptual model for sort of how biogeochemical cycling is expressed within the Reynolds Creek experimental watershed, primarily as a function of this gradient in precipitation as you go from very, very dry and arid at the bottom to temperate at towards the top of the watershed. So there's an increasing gradient in precipitation that's associated with the gradient in elevation. At the same time, mean annual temperatures are decreasing as you go from left to right. So one of our hypotheses is that there is this sort of sweet spot in the middle of the watershed where you're neither precipitation nor temperature limited in terms of productivity, and we hypothesize that we'll see that in various attributes of the carbon cycle. But our hypothesis is that we will see very strong contrasts in things like calcium carbonates as you go from the bottom of the watershed to the top, and correspondingly that at the top you might see more soil organic carbon than you do at the bottom. So this is kind of our conceptual model for this individual CZO. I'll come back to more generally maybe the need or a need for a broader effort to develop a conceptual model for the critical zone at the end of my talk. So how are we, what are we doing to sort of to answer this call, this charge, as part of the Reynolds Creek CZO? So a couple of my students, Caitlin Watson, who's here and had a poster yesterday, and Miguel Aguayo, who's back in Boise, have been working together on a project that is a sort of one-way coupling exercise to look at how a model like the weather research and forecasting model, when integrated sort of one way with a coupled framework, the PARFLOW model, which was developed in part by Reed Maxwell, who's just down the street in Golden, and the community land model is sort of resolving the surface water and energy balance characteristics. So what we're getting at here is trying to understand the role of, I think some of the things that Forrest was talking about, the spatial discretization of atmospheric forcings and the degree to which or the resolution required to actually resolve some of the underlying hydrologic and land surface processes. And so their posters sort of showcase some of the preliminary results that we have from a number of sort of numerical studies. And just to give you a quick flavor of what these look like. So this visualization here, so this is the Dry Creek experimental watershed, so the watershed that's sort of part of our extended platform in the Reynolds Creek CZO. This is a visualization of a single time snap of WRF output and precipitation, and actually this is linearly interpolated. The spatial resolution of WRF that we're actually running at in this simulation is 1 kilometer, and then Miguel just did a bilinear interpolation to get down to the scale of the PARFLOW model, which is 30 meters. And so the interesting thing here, right, is that it's not that interesting because it seems like the model is at least doing relatively well in reproducing soil moisture that's observed at a number of sites. This is just one of them within Dry Creek. There's a sort of mismatch here, and I want you to sort of think about why that mismatch might be occurring, because precipitation is happening here. But we see here as well that there's a secondary precipitation event, and the model by and large captures at least the wet up and the correct timing of that of the observed soil moisture. But so this is with WRF at 1 kilometer. If we go up to a spatial scale of WRF at 9 kilometers, which is still finer than a lot of the sort of off-the-shelf meteorological products that are used to drive land surface models, within the community, The rainfall picture, so you're getting one figure of rainfall, one number for rainfall at this particular instance in time that's being fed to the PARFlow model. Of course, that's sort of ridiculous in such a high contrast environment, but we wanted to see what the ramifications were anyway. And if we look here now, the model is still, PARFlow is still sort of seeing this wet up, which is, it's capturing sort of this peak event, but now this same sort of secondary precipitation event is now offset in time. And so the reason for that is that in this previous simulation, because of the added resolution in WRF at this spatial scale, this site is seeing this as a snow event, right? So we have snow being added to the model, and then, maybe a couple days later, things get warm enough to melt that snow, and that's when we see that increase in soil moisture, which is more sort of contemporaneous with the observed increase in soil moisture, whereas if you look at this particular simulation where we're driving PARFlow with a much coarser precipitation product, PARFlow sees this as a rainfall pulse, as liquid rainfall rather than snowfall. And so this causes an earlier wet up than is actually occurring in the observed signal. And so kind of one of the take-home messages here is that, and this, I don't think this is particularly novel, but I think that it's a nice demonstration of the fact that the resolution of the forcings is not just important in terms of resolving kind of the spatial distribution of precipitation amounts, it's also important in terms of being able to resolve the distribution in precipitation phase, which in these kind of high gradient environments is particularly important. You want liquid rainfall where it's liquid rainfall and snow where it's snow. This has ramifications for this sort of soil carbon message that we're telling here at Reynolds Creek CZO. And the way that it sort of, so these are very preliminary results, and we haven't wrapped our head quite around these, but my other student, Reggie Walters, has basically gone through the effort of using Biome BGC and trying to sort of spin up a hill slope scale estimate of the sort of current distribution of soil carbon throughout the watershed, or the distribution of soil carbon under sort of the present climate, right? So Biome BGC is just sort of a straightforward geochemical cycling model that can develop the stores and stocks of soil carbon in the soil. And so he's done a couple of kind of numerical manipulation experiments with kind of perturbing precipitation, and we definitely see that, again, perhaps not surprisingly, that when you perturb precipitation, the distribution of carbon that you get relative to what's observed, or what would be the climatological background, varies as a product of that precipitation, and that variation is also dependent on the depth of the soil. So we see this sort of importance here in the way that we can think of the depth of the critical zone being a control on the distribution of soil carbon throughout the watershed. And this is sort of not the only, so the climate here is not the only story. There's also an important story with respect to, we think, things like disturbance and grazing, and potentially the accuracy of the size of our bucket, the size of that soil thickness. So this is preliminary, again, this is preliminary data. This is the distribution of soil carbon that Reggie has established with the Biome BGC model by basically running it for, how many years was it, Reggie? Like 300, 3,000, somewhere in that? 3,000? 3,000. 3,000 years with just sort of repeated climate. And so this, you can think of this as being the distribution of soil organic matter or soil organic carbon that is in equilibrium with sort of the contemporary climate. At the same time, in the Reynolds Creek CZO, we're collecting, we've done, these points where we're observing soil carbon have been established in an attempt to sort of stratify the watershed into important zones where we think we're at least doing a good job of capturing the distribution of soil carbon throughout the watershed. And what's interesting is that, say for these 2 points, the model, maybe the sort of equilibrium distribution of soil carbon is actually the model does a pretty good job of capturing what's observed, which was maybe a bit of a surprise to me, save for these 2 points where it does a terrible job. But we're still sort of trying to wrap our head around what the implications of these 2 sort of points are. Why was it so bad here? Is it just some peculiarities that are not being sort of resolved or captured by a relatively simple model like BioBGC, or is there another story there with respect to something like fire or some other disturbance? So this is sort of work that's kind of that's in progress, and we're a sort of young CZO, and so I hope to have a more complete story for you, or maybe Reggie will when he comes back next year. Yeah, is that fair? Okay. All right. So what are the opportunities sort of that are on the horizon? So with this, I'm going to start to look forward in terms of what are the next things that both we're doing in the Reynolds Creek CZO, but maybe which are more applicable to additional CZOs and provide opportunities for cross-CZO science and engagement. A couple of these are in this integration of models and data to advance understanding of cross-scale interactions, and I have a brief slide on that that's next. There's been a lot of work that's gone into understanding the role of aspect and slope on controlling the spatial distribution of water, energy, and biogeochemistry. And I think that work actually has a lot of possibilities for sort of engaging that Earth systems modeling community, because these are currently spatial scales that are not resolved by the land surface models that are within the GCMs. And the question is, does that hill slope scale variation matter? And I think that's an open question. So does it matter in terms of the global atmosphere and the climate? Another one that I'll sort of briefly gloss over is this idea of whether or not we need to explicitly represent the role of humans in disturbing the critical zone. But there's also opportunities in terms of the modeling frameworks that are out there to facilitate network modeling efforts. So synthesis between models and data, this is sort of the topic of the theme of this CSDMS meeting. And it's one that's sort of near and dear to my heart, and what I would say is that what's important about it is that this synthesis between models and data, whether we think about that as being sort of data assimilation or just improved ways for comparing models with data and data that may be kind of indirect observations of what it is we actually are trying to interrogate, improved synthesis between these models and data really has the capacity to potentially help us better reconcile kind of the emergence of cross-scale interactions. So how are things like grazing affecting, kind of regional weather, climate, and biogeochemistry? So we have these models. They tend to be sort of applied at relatively fine spatial resolutions. And at the same time, we have these remote sensing observations that are, I'll move on to the next slide and sort of show what this sort of looks like. So we have, there's a whole bunch of new and existing remote sensing data sets that maybe are related to the things that we care about as sort of surface dynamicists, but not sort of direct observations of those things. So leaf area index is a perfect example of that. So the question then becomes, how can we constrain these data to our models to sort of improve the performance of the model by just ingesting that data, but B, hopefully identify gaps and deficiencies of our models and use that as a mechanism to continually refine these models. And so as part of a NASA terrestrial ecology grant that I'm a co-PI on with my colleague Nancy Glenn at Boise State, we are getting some acquisitions of Avaris and G and some LiDAR. This is a hyperspectral product. This is a LiDAR product. And the idea is that these provide relatively novel ways to characterize vegetation structure. And the idea is that we want to assimilate this into the ecosystem demography model, which is actually a height-structured model. So a model that explicitly sort of evolves and resolves some structural characteristics of these ecosystems. Another thing that has been noticed in a number of critical zone observatories is the role that aspect is playing as a control on the spatial distribution of irradiance and how that propagates into other things like water, energy, and biogeochemical cycles. Again, this is a place where I think that there's potential for collaborations with the Earth systems modeling community because of the way that, just for computational efficiency, these land surface models in these ESMs are resolved in ways that, things like the vegetation within a pixel share common pool resources like soil moisture, and we know that in reality there's organization in the landscape that occurs for very important reasons because there are these sort of hill slope and valley segments that's sort of maybe not represented or not captured in the existing generation of land surface models. And so the question is, does this land surface organization, the way that we experience the land surface in the field, does this organization really matter when you talk about it in the context of the regional or even the global climate? Like, does the atmosphere really care about this hill slope scale organization? There's reason to think that we should at least look into this question because a student of ours, Mike Poulos, developed a relatively simple index of hill slope asymmetry and applied it basically throughout the entire Western Cordillera and found that actually hill slope asymmetry, this is from the National Elevation Data Set. He also looked at SRTM data. So hill slope asymmetry is more the norm and not the exception. And so we see this more often than we see sort of hill slope homogeneity. So the question is that given its prevalence, what influence does it have in terms of scaling back up into the larger Earth system? The human dimensions thing is something that I've become really interested and sort of passionate about lately. As I mentioned before, so our land modifications, so our grazing, prescribed fire, removal of things like juniper, this occurs against a context of, or a template of climate lithology and geomorphology. And so the effect of these human activities on the landscape are going to be differentially expressed I got 1 minute, all right, I'm going to get there, are going to be differentially expressed at the different CZOs. And the question is do we need to explicitly represent sort of the behavioral aspects of humans and our agencies in how they perturb the landscape? So I think that there's additional room to sort of think about these critical zone observatories as places where we can study these sort of strongly coupled human environmental or human and natural systems and think about the two-way couplings between societal infrastructure and the background sort of biogeochemical or biophysical sort of systems. And it's evident that these are that there are human dimensions at a number of CZOs. So there's a new CZO, the Intensively Managed Landscapes, which is in Illinois and Iowa, and this is a completely sort of replumbed hydrologic system and different nutrient input than was sort of historically present. That's changed residence times, it's changed connectivity. So what is the sort of long-term? What are the long-term ramifications of that? Christina River has sort of a legacy of non-point source loading. Eel River has this amazingly interesting problem of illegal marijuana farms and the associated hydrologic modifications. Ask Mary Power about that sometime and you'll get an earful. And then at Reynolds Creek, as I said, we have this mixture of public and private land management activities. At the same time, there's an emergence of kind of these modeling frameworks. So Chris Duffy and his colleagues at Penn State have put together this sort of PIM-X, what I call this. So there's a number of different incarnations of the PIM model addressing a number of different sort of spatial and time scales that they've been sort of working on in support of the Shale Hills CZO. Some of you have seen the Land Lab framework today, which really, so for those of you that are not familiar with Land Lab, even after today, what's really fascinating and I think great about Land Lab is that it's not a model per se, but it's again, my Don Draperish side would say that this is the Arduino of land modeling. So it's a rapid prototyping framework to put together models of the surface, and for that, I think it's a really great framework to be able to sort of do both very detailed and sophisticated interrogations of the land surface, but also to put together models in a relatively quickly and efficient way. So some final challenges. There's, like I said, there's we modelers of this that are affiliated with the critical zone observatories have not gotten together and said, let's put together a conceptual model or map of the critical zone and a sort of model agnostic version of conceptual modeling. And I think that would be a good idea for something to address. Cross-CZO communication is a challenge, and I think that the reality here is that we all have monthly telecons, and nobody wants to add another one to their schedule. And again, these network scale modeling efforts were not originally in scope, so it's just a matter of sort of finding the interesting science that can maybe, and intercomparisons that can be done inexpensively and quickly, and at the same time looking forward to saying, what is it that we can do that's bigger. I think that this is a great opportunity for the systems community and the infrastructure and other initiatives like EarthCube to sort of play a facilitative role. And so that's why I'm very excited to be a part of the CSDMS CZO focus research group. And I think I'll leave it there. And as a postscript, Chris Duffy, who's the chair of the CZO FRG, Scott Peckham and Adrian Harpold, and a number of us are working on a workshop proposal. These would be the sort of outcomes that we hope to produce from that workshop. So if anybody's interested in participating in this, just shoot me an email, because I think that NSF would love to see a lot of people saying, yeah, we would really love to see this happen. So I will leave it there.